Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. In this week's episode, we're discussing how MEL Magazine reinvented the men's magazine for the 21st century. Peruse a newsstand full of men's magazines, and you'll probably notice a few common themes. The cover either features a bikini model or a suit-clad male celebrity. Inside, you'll find stories meant to appeal to what many in the mid-20th century would have considered the ideal man. Articles about scotch, cigars, and custom suits. You won't find many of those kinds of features in MEL Magazine, a digital-only publication that launched in 2015. Owned and operated by Dollar Shave Club, MEL aims its content at the under 40, educated, likely urban male. A man less inclined to traditional gender roles who is much more in touch with his feelings and spends an inordinate amount of time on the internet. I recently interviewed Editor-in-Chief Josh Schollmeyer about how he came to define the 21st century male, where his staff sources its article ideas, and how Dollar Shave Club will profit from its investment in the magazine. One quick thing before we jump into the interview. This podcast recently published its 100th episode, and to mark the occasion, I wrote and published an article that tackled what I learned from producing 100 episodes of a podcast. I gave tips on how to grow a podcast audience, how to improve your show's production with very little extra effort, and how to create a pipeline of incredible guests. There's only one way to access articles like this, by subscribing to my Substack newsletter. Subscribing gets you media industry news and analysis straight to your inbox, and it's the only way to support the work I do on this podcast. To subscribe, go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Or just Google the word Simon Owens and newsletter. Okay, on to my interview with Josh. Hey Josh, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So you're the editor of MEL Magazine, which I would categorize as kind of reimagining of what a men's magazine could be in the 21st century. But you actually spent several years before that working for Playboy, which is a more traditional men's magazine. And I wanted to start there. First of all, what was your role there?
Well, I started off working on the print side as a senior editor, and then in all of its infinite wisdom, it had licensed out many of its digital properties to a third party, which is called MindGeek, which oversees a number of adult properties, including Pornhub. And almost immediately, despite being a fairly lucrative licensing arrangement, realized that was not going to be great for the brand as they were trying to reimagine it for the 21st century. So I was sort of a one-man team in the early days of trying to architect what Playboy digital coverage could look like in a very different world. Everything from where social sexual values were heading to the definition of the quote unquote girl next door. It's also just, as you well know, an ever shifting media market. So my job was to try to make the case that Playboy could actually have something meaningful to offer digital audiences outside of what would be kind of the no-brainer in terms of the more adult stuff.
And my kind of reading on men's magazines is they haven't fared well. Like, obviously, the mainstream media has been suffering a lot over the last 10, 15 years, but they've been especially bad. Playboy has been struggling, Esquire, Maxim magazine, which I don't even know if it even exists. And so, like, while you were there, did you have any frustrations about, the kind of direction of how men's magazines were? Is my question make sense?
Yeah, 100%. I don't know if I had anything other than frustrations, frankly. I found it was just really hard there was no critical thinking really about where masculinity was headed. And, to your point, men's lifestyle publishing has really struggled over the last decade. And yet over the last 10 or 15 years, I think on the women's side of the equation, there's been some really great stuff from sort of New York Magazine's The Cut to Jezebel, to back in the day, The Hairpin, even the stuff Broadly was doing with Vice. And I just didn't understand why, we had to have this kind of archetypal man that everything needed to ladder up to. And yet I didn't find any of that particularly resonant. I didn't see it being resonant to anyone in my life. And frankly, I didn't really see it resonating with readers or visitors to the site. And so I was super frustrated. I was even more frustrated because I thought of, in terms of where gender and sexuality were going, that Playboy was really well positioned and suited to stake a claim on some of those conversations and really be a thought leader in the way it was in the 1950s and 1960s with the Playboy philosophy, with the Playboy Forum, with some of the philanthropic stuff, freedom of speech stuff that hefted all the way, into the early and late 70s. And I just felt like everybody was so beholden to this print magazine and didn't realize that they were storytellers first and foremost, and the medium didn't matter as much. And two, again, felt they couldn't break from this mold of this guy who supposedly only cared about, the things that they could sell advertising against. And so I was remarkably frustrated. And I was even more frustrated once we started doing content that I wanted to do, and it was really overperforming, and the brand itself just couldn't bring itself to give in and let it, let that breathe and develop.
And it was kind of rooted still in that kind of 1960s aesthetic of a guy who smokes cigars, drinks scotch, wears a suit, that's what you're kind of talking about, how it never really escaped that kind of coverage.
I had to do a number of at least 2 or 3 front of the book articles on like bespoke axes. And I asked the editor, like, what am I supposed to do? Like, what do you do with an axe? And I think the feedback I got was something along the lines, well, cool guys, hang axes in their apartments or whatever. And I was like, okay, but like, that doesn't seem real to me. And, and I think across the board, all the stuff you mentioned, that's the stuff that advertisers want to believe. That's the stuff that Playboy wanted to believe. I think that, I come from a very blue collar background in Chicago. And I think there was an era, even with my dad and certainly with my grandfather, where aspiration was dreaming on that stuff. And I just think starting really with Gen X and certainly all the way through Gen Z, aspiration is not about consumer goods, right? Aspiration is about lived experiences and, actually giving something valuable back to the world. And it just wasn't, and just the tenor of the staff, if you didn't know about sort of like the micro distilled gin from Tennessee, you were somehow less than a man. And it just, it makes people feel guilty and bad about themselves. And, if I felt that way working there, imagine how the reader must have felt, and again, more than anything, like there's been a giant rejection, I think, against that kind of top-down media across the board, of this kind of elitism and coastal kind of, we're going to force you to see things a certain way or think about things, or you're not cool enough if you don't do this. And, I felt like, again, there's so much happening with gender. There's so much social change happening that we were, we I guess, pun intended, with Playboy, we just looked like boobs trying to pretend that all of that stuff wasn't happening and that somehow the 1960s or 1980s or even 1990s were still relevant.
And speaking of boobs, it wasn't, if I'm remembering correctly, this was a weird kind of transition period for Playboy where they were doing away with kind of the nude modeling, I think, and were trying to launch like a safe for work website. Like that, what was did you think that they had the sexuality thing pinned down very well?
No, I mean, I left before that all happened. I mean,
okay.
Full disclosure, part of my job was to bring the brand onto Facebook, onto Instagram. I launched the first Playboy app in the App Store when Steve Jobs said that would never happen. So look, there were realities of the marketplace, right? You have to be able to function on those platforms. And for better or worse, those platforms are sort of the arbiters of for lack of better, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And so you have to play by their rules, right? I saw no reason whatsoever, though, that the brand still couldn't lean into the more adult elements while still doing business on those platforms. So I never thought the idea of going non-nude was super smart. I mean, this was a highly NSFW brand, right? In an era with like Tumblr, where porn just isn't, or adult content just isn't that shocking. In a Tumblr era, that stuff's next to sneakerhead stuff and food stuff, and so I just didn't see that brand was very weird in terms of how much it clutched its pearls about some of the things that it was born out of. I felt very strongly that you could have your cake and eat it too. I just think overall that brand was such a big battleship and had been so weighed down by debt and bad decisions, there was no way that they were going to be able to lean into rebuilding the brand every time they were going to go for the easy score. And, that's very, very difficult to tonally thread it all together and tell a consistent, not incoherent message about who you are and what you stand for. And this was also the era of I would put up one thing on Facebook and we'd get 250,000 page views off of, the 20 million fans we had there. Everybody deluded themselves into thinking that traffic was real, that it meant something. And so it was very easy to go after kind of cheap clicks. And my whole thing was, I just don't think that that's what's going to interest advertisers. I don't think that that's ultimately what's going to develop reader loyalty, brand loyalty. And, I think I was proven right in that. I think we've moved into a much better place online with content where brands do matter. Even when you see this from independent creators, whether it's on TikTok or YouTube, I mean, they create a branded channel or a branded handle, and users know what they can get from that. And I think, Playboy just saw sort of the Facebook click rush and thought that that was the way of the future. And, frankly, I think that was a miscalculation.
Did you begin to form ideas for how you would run a men's magazine differently while you were there?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I did something on Kinja with Tommy Craggs, who was really helpful, called Playboy Safe for Work. That was basically the Playboy forum, all about the stuff that we're talking about. And it was doing really well. We would just do 10 posts a week, and we got close to 2 million, monthly visitors on what was essentially just sort of like a B-roll blog or I shouldn't say B-roll, like a prototype essentially for what I was thinking, right? And, we had a lot of buy-in from Tommy at Deadspin. We had a lot of buy-in from Max Reed at Gawker. We had a lot of buy-in from some of the Jezebel editors, and they were cross-posting that stuff, and a lot of it was really working. And I was, again, frustrated, to your earlier question, about these numbers are interesting. Like, we're not even trying very hard here. We're not even really, this is a prototype. And that's sort of what spurred the conversations as I started having them with Michael Dubin at Dollar Shave Club, who was looking to start a content wing of, he wanted an Esquire meets Vice. And when we started talking, I said, I'm kind of doing that. And I'm telling you, there's something here, not only do we know that there's white space in terms of, and that's an odious term, so I apologize, but not only do we know that there's an opportunity, but I have some numbers, the early numbers that would seem to back that up. And it's a totally different readership, frankly, that, the Playboys, Esquires, and GQs of the world were really trying to reach out to, but hadn't been able to connect.
So tell me about that, how the idea of MEL Magazine became a reality. Like, you said that you started some conversations with the folks at Dollar Shave Club. Was this something you were pushing for, that they were pushing for? What was the early kind of business case for it? What tell me about those early days of it kind of coming to fruition.
Yeah, so I was miserable, and I was just really miserable. And a recruiter reached out to me, and they said that Dollar Shave Club really wants to start a content arm. And a couple things. I had just gotten done working on the Roger Ebert documentary. I had just done a bit. I have a very deep journalistic, non-narrative journalism background, and I just I was like, I'm not the guy for this. Like, and you have to. Dollar Shave Club's much bigger now, but at the time it was also small. I think it was only 18 months into its history. It had just, it had come off the big video about a year ago, and it started to establish itself, but, it wasn't kind of what it is today. And, but the recruiter said, I think you'd like this guy. You should talk to him. And I was like, I started thinking about it, and I thought, nobody's going to get this right. Like, talking to all the people that I've been talking to in sort of legacy media, even new media, I was like, I don't really love any of this. Like, nobody seems to have a great handle. On the legacy side, they're completely lost. On the new media side, they don't really know how this could be a business or how to, it doesn't seem run really well. And so I was like, if anybody's going to figure this out, especially in the men's space, it's not going to be somebody in publishing, And Michael and I talked, and we talked off and on for like 4 months. I remember I just had a baby, and I would like lock myself in my car outside, and we would talk at like 9:00 at night. And, it was a real leap of faith. People thought I was crazy. The first year was brutal. It's just really hard to get something. It's hard to get anything off the ground. And it's really hard to get something off the ground that's completely different. That's also not coming from a media entity, a traditional media entity. And so it was really hard, It was hard to convince people to even take my calls. But I'm nothing if not persistent. And I think everybody felt there was an opportunity there, right? I think everybody understood that the men's space really needed some reinvention. And I think once we were able to put some victories up on the board, some stuff that worked, some interesting hires, it was all, again, kind of 1.0 the first 18 months. And that's a brutal time. It's really hard to build something like this. It's mostly naysayers. But you get to a point where, you start proving people wrong. And that's kind of where I thrive the most. So, that's sort of the journey. It's hard to imagine. It's kind of like the first 18 months are a bit of a blur. It's just, it's so much blueprinting, and trying things out. And, it's a challenging but very exciting time, even though, there's not that feedback loop. Now we have 4.5 million people coming to the site every day or every month, and tons of Twitter engagement and stuff like that. That feedback loop feels really good, right? What you're doing well and not well. It's harder in those early days, but also I find it exhilarating to kind of fly without a net.
So like Dollar Shave Club, it's not a Fortune 100 company. You hear about like GE that puts like a lot of money towards like a super high production podcast like The Message. But like I feel like Dollar Shave Club, like they couldn't do as much experimental stuff as that. I've read a lot of coverage of MEL Magazine, and a lot of the coverage positions it as a kind of form of content marketing for Dollar Shave Club, like assuming that people who read it might be Dollar Shave Club customers or become them. But I don't know if that's really accurate, especially since there's really little mention of Dollar Shave Club on the website itself. And so I was hoping you could like maybe parse that out a little bit for me. Like, would it be accurate to say that MEL Magazine is eventually expected to form a business model that makes it sustainable on its own?
Yeah, I mean, I would say two things. I think that that's absolutely correct. On the first question, I think that this notion of content marketing and all this is kind of silly. I mean, I've never had more journalistic freedom in my life than I've had creating this site. Just because we're brand backed, I don't see why that's such a struggle for people to sort of wrap their mind around. We've also more than established ourselves as a very credible editorial entity. And we have, a suite of kind of awards and or mentions that back that up. I mean, we have the New York Times editorial board asking Pete Buttigieg about one of our articles. So it's, I find that hard to believe in kind of sour grapes from others when they talk about this as being a content marketing endeavor, because it really is anything but. But that gets to the second part of your question. I think you're exactly right. I mean, this brand incubation period has been really great for us, or this incubation period has been great for us. And, we have been able to, and Michael's early edict was just go out there and make great stuff, own this category, reinvent it. And that's where the shared DNA is really important, right? Like Michael, to use another odious term, is a disruptor and did that very successfully with Dollar Shave Club. He's also very irreverent. The Dollar Shave Club promise is very intuitive. And I think a lot of the stuff that we do shares that DNA. But we have gotten to a point where, this can be its own thing. We know that, there is a point in time where in order to really grow, it needs to be its own thing. And, that's why I'm really excited for 2021, because that's going to be the year where we've left a lot of these opportunities on the table, because we've had the fortune of being able to be incubated with Mike and with Dollar Shave Club. And we've also had a lot of opportunities that we've turned down in order to kind of get everything right and where we want it. And now we're reaching that moment. So I'm very excited to see that come to fruition.
So let me draw an analogy here. This is almost like AT&T buying Time or Warner Media, in the sense that they're slightly adjacent businesses, but two separate, completely different things that might have a few synergies with each other, but are supposed to stand up on their own separately, right?
Yeah, 100%. We've always set out to kind of make the 21st century Esquire, and again, I've had the freedom to establish that tone and brand, and I don't think you need the time to do that. It gets back to what I was talking about with the first 18 months. I mean, we've been doing this, 4 years, which sounds both like a lot and not a little time to build up a totally organic audience of 4 or 5 million a month, to build up the kind of credibility that we, you need to do that in order to, I think, turn this into a sustainable business, and a sustainable brand. And so absolutely. I mean, I think how this was going to evolve, is always a little bit, not to get all Buddhist about it, but it's sort of just the way the things turn, and I think we've reached a point now where we feel good about our ability to stand on our own 2 feet.
So you started off on Medium, right? Why did you move off of that?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of this stuff is evolution, right? When you start doing something, you're going to have these growth stages and spurts. And, in the early days, it made sense. We wanted to put the money that we knew we could spend on this, we wanted to put into the creative. And, I'd seen way too many sites sort of get bogged down, and media brands get bogged down by just how expensive technology, digital product, all that stuff could be. And Medium, you come to the right place at the right time, I guess, in terms of, the Ringer was, they were launching that whole publishing program. It made a lot of sense to launch there. And we built up an audience there, about 3 million, I believe. And, at a certain point, you don't own that audience. It's hard to even get the emails of the people that, the 40,000 or whatever Medium followers we had. And it was just time to, with the publishing program there ending, and there wasn't going to be much in terms of being able to kind of own our own ad sales and all of that kind of stuff. It just was time to, it was time to, again, kind of break out on our own and see if we could keep those numbers. It's hard because they have such domain authority that SEO took a hit, but we knew that was going to be kind of a 6-month, pain point in order to kind of build it up and be able to own our own audience. And that over the last
and what did you move on? And what did you move on to?
Yeah, we just built a little WordPress instance. I mean, I'm a big believer in that technology is not that important. I mean, we built a pretty influential site starting on Medium, right? I think if you get your message out there, people will find it. I also just think that whereas the readership is as dispersed as it ever has been before, and you really have to find the platforms that really work for you and just hone in on them instead of trying to be everything everywhere. And so, yeah, I mean, I didn't feel like we didn't need a whiz bang site. We just needed something that looked kind of cool and that could contain our content that we could then market through, Twitter and some of the other places that we're especially good at, tonally.
Let's talk about your specific editorial output. Is it mostly articles? Are you investing in podcasts or videos too? What's your kind of main focus? Yeah,
so it's always been longer form zeitgeisty stuff, right? So we did have a film arm for a couple of years. We made a literally kind of short documentaries, which were nominated, one of which was nominated for an Emmy. But it's difficult to see where online video is going. I also like the idea, again, not to keep pounding the kind of brand bell, but the more you develop a brand, the easier it is to figure out where that brand could fit. And so we've been really good. We do zeitgeisty topical stuff, and we're particularly good at making, that's prosaic, but that's sort of where, our bread and butter is. And I think we can pivot, the better we get at that, the easier it is to pivot to other things.
And so it's mainly kind of like long form article writing now, stylistic.
Heavily reported. There's very little that goes on. We have a couple people that do more op-ed-y stuff, I guess, takes, but for the most part, everything's got to have 1 to 3 sources. It's true. I think it's as close as like magazine journalism that internet content can be. It has voice, it has some reporting, and it takes a bigger picture view of things.
So let's get back to the original question about what separates you from a traditional men's magazine. Looking at what you've published in recent months, can you give my listeners like a sense of something that you've published that like a GQ or an Esquire probably wouldn't?
Well, some of the best compliments I've ever gotten is people tell me men especially when they come to the site, that they feel seen. And I like that. I like when we can talk about stuff that guys feel like, I know that they're talking amongst themselves about, but we can find a wider way in. I think we've been really good on quarantine culture and, everything from, there was a great piece we did in the early days of quarantine about people who were like sitting at home and doing like MDMA and, just trying to pass the time. any which way. I mean, we do a lot of sexual health stuff that really works. I think that that's stuff that a lot of other brands are scared to talk about. But mostly, I think we cover where the world is going from a social change standpoint. I think we've done a lot of stuff in terms of Me Too over the last few years. Alana Hope Levinson, who's our brilliant deputy editor, she wrote a big piece at the end of the Weinstein year about what it was like to work at a men's lifestyle publication while all of this was going on. And we took all that stuff really head on. And, I feel like we've done a lot of that with the protests. We just did a video yesterday from Ernest Crosby, who's really great. And he did a short social video about why he could never vote for any white man who was alive, around segregation. We've really taken that stuff on head on. And I think, we're sort of the dirtbag left version of Barstool Sports. And I think that a lot of those other brands are just, there's pearl clutching around kind of the sexual wellness stuff, sexual health stuff, but also, men are a really interesting cohort right now. They, you can look at a lot of different demos and you can know right away kind of where they fall in the culture war and on kind of the Trump of it all, right? Except for men. And men are really split down the middle. And I think it's a civil war. And that's another thing we've covered a lot, is sort of the men's rights stuff, all of the different men's groups, the Boog Boys. We did a whole thing about these guys who were shooting up White Claws and, how they were basically sort of becoming a quasi-digital militia and how that was we were starting to see some of those same people in Michigan as some of the protests there at the State House and whatnot. And, we covered that stuff early. We covered it through the lens of where masculinity is going and this battle and civil war for masculinity that I don't think a lot of those other brands touch. And if they do, it's in this performatively woke way that is to either curry favor with sort of the blue check mafia on Twitter, or it just doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel like it's really, it's perfunctory.
There seems to be like a lot of emphasis on explaining what I guess I would call it like obscure sex trends or kink communities, online porn watching trends and porn watching production of certain trends. Do you feel like that's a niche that isn't very well covered by other outlets, especially media outlets?
They're totally scared of that stuff. And I can tell you that that's what people read, But the other thing too, is we've kind of tried to turn on its head a lot of men's magazine conventions, right? So the notion of, I'll give you two examples. The notion of putting George Clooney on the cover of Esquire because he just had babies and is somehow going to teach me about fatherhood is insane. There's nothing that I share in common with George Clooney other than the fact that we both have children. And there's nothing really that he can say that would truly resonate with me, right? On the flip side, it's the same thing of putting whatever XYZ kind of new starlet that you want on the cover in the way that these magazines, they're doing less and less because of Me Too, but used to have to do in order to move magazines, right? That's not what guys are necessarily thinking about. Yes, everybody wants to look at beautiful pictures of beautiful people. However, in real life, it's about, how do you have a better, more meaningful relationship, whether sexual or otherwise, with your significant other? And a lot of that is in those kind of communities that you're talking about that actually have the courage to talk about what turns them on, what makes them happy, romantically or sexually. And I think that's why that stuff really resonates with audiences. It's real. Those are, you can say niche and kink and all that stuff. And I don't know if that's necessarily true. There are a lot more people in those communities than you would think. It's broader than you would think. And I think talking about sex is a much healthier way. I don't know. I think part of what we do well is help people have those conversations in their real life, however the way in.
Well, when we talk about kind of like the business of media on this podcast and my newsletter, we talk about how a media outlet might have like some kind of unfair advantage or some kind of unique approach that kind of separates it and differentiates it. Is yours that you have the respectability of a mainstream media site? Like you're regularly cited by, the New York Times, Taylor Lorenz, and other well-respected people. Like you have that respectability, but at the same time, you're willing to cover subjects that most mainstream outlets won't touch. So you're able to kind of like ride that line perfectly.
I mean, I like to think we ride that line pretty perfectly. I think that I would say that we try to be fearless. And so whether that's on the sex coverage stuff, whether that's about Me Too, we try to be fearless. We also try not to be, I don't pretend to have all the answers. I don't even pretend to have any of the answers. Self-righteousness in a lot of ways is the biggest sin. And so while we're fearless, we're also cognizant and self-aware of the fact that we're working through all of this stuff too. And we're trying to find our way through a very challenging world, never more so than this year. And I think that there's an honesty and candor to all of that people seem to appreciate. And the fact that we are able to have and discuss private, quote unquote, private things. And that doesn't even have to be sex stuff. I mean, some of our best posts have been like, why do guys always touch the wall over the door when they walk through it? Tall guys, right? That did incredibly well. We did a piece about Miles Klee, who's just absolutely just brilliant. He wrote a piece about in quarantine arguing with his living girlfriend about she leaves half the LaCroix can around everywhere, and he goes around at the end of the day and just collects them. And what was he supposed to do with that? That did tremendously well. And why is that? That's kind of fearlessness to talk about our own lives and work through our own neuroses through content. But also that's kind of like a private detail that actually really resonates with people because they can relate to it. I mean, that's what we always call sort of our Seinfeldian special sauce, right? That kind of Larry David, Seinfeld, kind of nothing, it's about nothing, but it's about everything actually. And I think, so threading all that stuff together, I think is through that kind of honesty and fearlessness. And again, willing not to be so serious about ourselves.
Do you rely mainly on staff writers or freelancers?
I would say it's about 80% staff writers, and we have a couple pieces a day usually that come from freelancers. Although how you define freelancers, I mean, there's sort of like three kind of categories, right? There's more the permalancer who is going to write, a few times a week for us. And then there's sort of like our favorite sons and daughters, who are going to pop up every couple weeks. And then there's sort of what I call flybys, which are people either we're trying out or they're new, or they may only come through one time because it's a certain topic. But largely, yeah, I mean, this is an editor-writer driven site. So a lot of it's going to be in-house because we're able to kind of really shape it. We have a daily writer's room that kind of functions like a TV writer's room, and everybody pitches, and then we kind of make each other laugh and sort of shine it up and then start getting after it every day.
And your non-male ratio of writers is probably larger than the average men's magazine.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to their numbers, but it's always been pretty half and half.
Uh-huh. So tell me about your audience growth over the years. Like, how quickly is it growing, and where are you seeing a lot of that growth coming from?
Yeah, so like I said, we got up to about 3 million more on Medium. We took a step back knowing we're going to take a step back. And now we're up to about 4.5 million a month. Certainly saw a pretty big uptick at kind of quarantine, I would say. But have been able to really hold all of that audience and continue to grow. My audience strategy, and I tell Cooper Fleischman, who runs audience development for us all the time and is really great at it, I don't want any part of the portfolio really to be more than 40%. I want it to be a pretty even distribution because, again, you see what are the variables of places like when you depend on Facebook and YouTube, you don't have any control over them. When they change an algorithm, when they change whatever the terms. So we really try to look at, how do we distribute this evenly across a lot of stuff? So, we do have maybe not the biggest Twitter following, but we have a very, very influential Twitter following of a lot of people like Taylor, who's been immensely great and nice to us and kind to us. And, they amplify a lot of what we do. I look at Twitter, frankly, as kind of like our PR arm. It's getting stuff out there and then journalists find it and they push it around. I loved, we did a piece, one of my writers, Brian Van Hooker, who does like insane stuff. He pitched how correct is the Domino's pizza tracker, and then he staked out his local Domino's and his local Domino's delivery guy. He ordered the pizza from it, and then And that's a piece that like Helen Rosner, the food writer at the New Yorker, tweeted out, but also Barstool Sports wrote a blog about. So, that's kind of, I don't know, we cut through with that kind of inventiveness, and it sort of finds its way throughout the internet and builds on itself. Now, we definitely, SEO is really important to us. It's a little bit, I'm sure you know this, it's a little like it's all the non-sexy stuff. It feels like it's 2008 again. It's email, SEO. There's a lot of stuff. We do a lot of service content, again, kind of Seinfeldian service stuff that does really well over time, right? Because we just have this kind of gift to presuppose what people are searching for, and then we're able to identify some of that stuff and then create content just around that. Dig and some of the last aggregators of the left have been really great to us. We've seen a lot of gains on Apple News and Google News. So I'm happy to say that it's a bit of a stew. There's really not one thing that if it went away, it would sort of like wipe us out traffic wise.
And you do a lot of like explanation of slang. So I'm guessing you get some of the, some of that Urban Dictionary Google juice where people are trying to figure out what does this word mean. Like I saw you had an explainer for the word simp, stuff like that. I'm guessing you have like probably higher than average Google traffic than the average website.
Yeah, and you know why? Is because we get that is, I wish it was a cynical traffic ploy. Like I wish we were that strategic about it. I mean, that's just literally in the writer's room, somebody's been like, this is going around on TikTok, the meaning of it's changed. And the good news is, again, we kind of have a gift of getting to that stuff first. So that helps in a couple ways, right? It helps from Google's standpoint, but it also helps in the fact that like that's something that Taylor especially like pushed out, and so we're able to kind of not just establish a beachhead from all the ways you're talking about, but sort of culturally become like Wife Guy was another thing that we were sort of way ahead of the curve on and helped popularize and mainstream that. That's sort of that great, to your point earlier, that's that kind of great happy medium of like, we get there before everybody else, but also there's a lot of tactical return on that as well.
But at the same time, like I feel like someone who, like I was looking through your articles, I saw one about the rise of interest in big natural boobs. That's something that like someone probably wouldn't be super proud to share to their Facebook wall. Is that something that you see in terms of like how shareable certain articles are just because they're on subjects that people don't want to display, any interest in publicly?
That post over the last 2 weeks on Twitter has probably been our most engaged shared post. Like we did it on election day. It was like, here, stare at big naturals instead of getting stressed about the election. And that was shared a bunch by very prominent people in the Twitter scape. So, I think, again, some of it's just the courage of, listen, what you're going to get from us, right? So, and there's a certain kind of like bad boy quality of what we do, and then people wanting to share that to kind of get a little hit of that.
What's your relationship to your audience in the sense of like, do you interact with them in any way, or is it mainly kind of like a one-way broadcast of content to readers?
No, I hope they feel it. I mean, we interacted with them a lot on Twitter. I mean, I hope, we've gotten things really right. And people have been great about pointing that out, and we've gotten some stuff wrong. And I'm always willing to hear, I'm always willing to hear what people think about our stuff and how we could do better or how we could have thought about something differently. One of the best things about being on Kinja when I was at Playboy was that Gawker media audience in the comments. And, some days you go home and you're like, God, I just suck. Like, they really beat me up. But on the flip side, the hardest days weren't the mean stuff. The hardest days was the shit that was mean and right, and there was so much stuff in there that was like, God, you had to be mean about this, but you're exactly right. And I found that made me much better, as an editor. It made me much better as a thinker. It helps you, you really do have to, there's pretty much very little that goes on the site that I don't read on a daily basis. And I think, it's important because, every sentence, every word choice matters now, and that Gawker comment section experience that I had for a year was a huge lesson in terms of the audience is really smart. It makes sense to listen to them. Now, not all the time, everybody's got an opinion about everything, right? So, and you have to sift through those opinions and understand which ones matter. But like, you always have to be open, I think. And with a new publication like with MEL and Taylor's name's come up a couple times, like we have these evangelists who found us kind of early and helped us introduce us to the world. I'd be crazy not to hear and think or listen to what they have to say, and I like it because it builds this relationship between us and the audience. I feel like we're growing together, and that's fun. And I think that that's also something you're not going to get from a more established legacy brand.
So it sounds like your strategy was to focus on the audience first, building it up, becoming part of the cultural conversation, building up the brand, and then think about a business model later. But it also sounds like you do need to become sustainable. So what is the plan for a future business model? Like I feel like there could be an e-commerce play there in terms of, getting people to buy stuff. I feel like advertising might be hard in some ways because so many programmatic ad buys block certain keywords and stuff like that. Subscriptions might be in the mix. What are you thinking as you're moving forward about terms of like driving revenue?
Yeah, I would say revenue to me is the same way that we just discussed traffic, right? I don't think that there's a single bullet anymore. And I think that you have to be very creative, and I think you have to have a lot of different buckets. There's huge opportunities for us on the creative services side. That's something we've been approached with a lot. There's a lot of opportunities, and something else we've been approached with is just insights. I mean, we do understand a male consumer that a lot of brands are struggling to get. I think it's how you look at advertising, right? You're right. There are some blockers there maybe in terms of who we are and what we talk about. But I'd also argue there are a number of brands that feel like they don't have an outlet that stuff fits, when it comes to sexual health, when it comes to weed and some stuff like that. I definitely think we have a couple subscription things in the works that I think will really work. But again, IP is something we've been approached with on a couple of occasions from bigger studios or television networks about wanting to do either take some of our stuff and or do a MEL series. So I think, I'm not looking at any one of those things as a savior or has to be the thing, right? I think it's a matter of all of these faucets need to be turned on. We've done a lot of the groundwork in terms of what that could look like. And, we're ready to do that. But I'm not, again, looking at any one of them to sort of be the be all end all.
Is there someone on your staff whose full-time job it is to think about revenue and start planning for that? Or is that something that's still a hire that's sometime in the future?
I mean, that's something we're currently working on.
So there's nobody who's like a chief revenue officer or anything like that?
Not yet, but I mean, it's definitely, we're having those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sounds like something that you're not really ready to announce anything yet.
I mean, I think we're very aware of the opportunities that we have, and we're very aware that is the kind of role that we need in order to capitalize on those in the best possible way.
Okay, Josh. Well, those were all the questions I had for you. Where can people find you online?
Well, we are at melmagazine.com. That's MEL, and then magazine spelled exactly how you would think. And on Twitter, we are at WeAreMel.
Okay, well, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me. Okay, thanks for joining us. I'm actually on the lookout for new guests for this podcast. So if you do interesting stuff in digital content, whether you're a full-time YouTuber, a media executive, or run a cool niche newsletter, definitely reach out. My email address is simonowens@gmail.com. Okay, see you next week.